Good day, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. Last fall, President Biden and Xi Jinping met outside San Francisco, and since then, a relationship that had been deteriorating has seen something resembling stability set in, with a regular cadence of senior-level meetings and a recent follow-up conversation between the leaders. While the temperature may have cooled, the challenges facing the most important bilateral relationship of the 21st century remain. Elizabeth Economy is with me today to discuss the nature of this complex relationship, where we are, and where we go from here during this fraught election year and beyond. Liz is one of the country's foremost experts on China's politics and foreign policy. She's a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. From 2021 to 2023, she was the senior advisor for China to Secretary Gina Raimondo at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Previously, she was a senior fellow and the director for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations for over 10 years. She's the author of a number of books, primarily focused on China, most recently The World According to China, published in 2021. This conversation is timely given Liz is just back from Beijing, and she has the lead article in the May-June issue of Foreign Affairs titled China's Alternative Order and What America Should Learn from It. So Liz, thanks so much for being here today and for joining us on this important topic. Perhaps we can just sort of start, let's set the table with how you would characterize the nature of the relationship today. Here we are at the beginning of May 2024 in an election year. Talk about the status of the relationship between the U.S. and China.
Oh, thanks so much, Kevin. It's great to be here with you. So I think if we're looking at the relationship at this particular moment in time, I think I follow kind of the 90-10 rule, which is to say about 90% competition and 10% cooperation. And this really does represent a pretty fundamental shift from where we were a decade or a decade and a half ago, where I think we were more 90% cooperation and 10% competition and conflict. If you look back a little bit in history, we had a policy of engagement. We were focused on enhancing our relationship with Beijing. Business ties were expanding. Civil society ties were booming. Our overall emphasis was on bringing China into the international system, enabling China's middle class to grow, and helping China move toward a more open, market-based system, and even a more open political system. Today, however, as China's economy has grown, as its military has expanded, and as we have a new leadership in China, the relationship has been transformed really quite profoundly to one where we are now competing across many spheres, right? Engagement policy is done. And instead, we have, competition in the military sphere, competition in the economic sphere, and even competition for political influence. That being said, I do think that both sides are committed to stability. As you suggested, I think the Woodside Summit back in November between Presidents Xi and President Biden really tried to put a floor underneath the relationship to reestablish some important lines of communication across the mill-to-mill, across the economic dimension, and even on the political side. So fundamentally competitive, but with some efforts to maintain, levels and channels of communication and keep the relationship from devolving into any form of kinetic conflict.
How concerned are you, or would you characterize it as, after the balloon incident, things kind of reached kind of a very, very low point? President Xi and President Biden got it back up established that floor, so to speak, that you just referenced. We've had a lot of principals meetings since then. Secretary Blinken, Secretary Yellen, Secretary Raimondo, et cetera, mill-to-mill contact. So it's been a little bit steady since then. But I assume you don't think it's going to bounce off of that. This is kind of a plateau, if you will, before things can devolve again.
Yeah, I think you could think of it as a plateau. I think of it really as a kind of thin veneer of cooperation, while both sides continue to do everything they want to do to compete. And so I don't see, in many respects, what we have are these channels of communication. It's process begetting more process. And what we're not seeing, which I think, certainly I think we in the United States would like to see, is some really tangible outcomes, from these newly established dialogues. I can tell you, having participated in some of the econ dialogues, that there's a lot of goodwill on both sides. And I think, so we come to the table wanting to, make progress, wanting to see substantive progress. But I think in both countries, the political dynamics make it extremely difficult at this point in time. And to be frank, I think what we want from China, they're not prepared to give. And at this point, what China wants from us, we're also not prepared to give.
So, you've sort of alluded to the notion we're entering into the crazy political season with the U.S. election obviously coming up. And in an environment where every vote counts in a swing state like, say, a Pennsylvania, the big news this past week on the China front was the president announcing a tripling of tariffs on steel products and some other things. But it seems to me that, steel imports directly from China had already declined quite a bit. So this is more, China recognizes, I assume, to some degree that there's going to be this political domestic political noise in the United States. And that's, we understand it for what it is, as long as the average tariffs overall don't go up. I guess these kind of investigations into shipbuilding and maritime logistics and all of that are the things that they're probably more keeping their eye on than just on the steel tariff.
Yeah, I think that's true, except you may have noticed also that China just passed its own new tariff law. So they're actually getting in the business now of, talking about anti-dumping, talking about, retaliatory tariffs, which of course they undertook after President Trump levied the first set of tariffs. But I think they're starting to ramp up as well. I think the difference now from, again, say a decade ago when China was willing to put aside all that political noise surrounding an election year, is that when they look to the next 4 years, they don't see the potential for a real change in the U.S. domestic political situation in a way that would benefit China. So either they're going to get President Biden, where China policy has been very tough, or they're going to get President Trump, where China policy was also very tough and a little more sort of uncertain, the direction in which he was going to move. So for them, neither of these options is particularly attractive. And so while they may recognize the fact that this is politically driven, it doesn't mean they're prepared to excuse it in the hopes that, for example, President Biden gets reelected.
Do you think that, was China surprised? So President Trump imposed the tariffs on China. Were they surprised that President Biden not only sustained them, but kind of doubled down on them? In other words, the duration of this period has been something that they've had to endure.
Absolutely. I think not only were the Chinese surprised, I think many people in the U.S. were surprised as well that, the president maintained the tariffs. And I think the overall direction of U.S. trade policy more broadly, right, was much more protectionist, much more focused on, what they called a trade policy for the middle class, labor-centric. And so I think, as time has gone on over this administration, you can see quite clearly that this is an administration that, takes as, central, to its, economic policy, protection of labor, right? Protection of the middle class, bringing manufacturing back to the United States. So I think they were surprised, but now they're not surprised.
How did you, so it's become a cliche almost to say that, the one bipartisan issue in Washington is China policy. But I have to imagine then, even if that is true, if there's been a more hawkish move overall in Washington, there's got to be a spectrum amongst economic policymakers, strategic policymakers, foreign policymakers, and the like. Talk a little bit about where the argument is in Washington on that spectrum now.
Yeah, I think the argument probably plays out across a couple of dimensions. First, in terms of when we're doing the, technology controls, I think there are discussions about how aggressive we should be. Do we need to undertake more study to understand, exactly sort of the second, third, and fourth order impacts of a particular decision? Do we have the technological expertise within the U.S. government to make these decisions? And, to be frank, Secretary Raimondo has talked about this, right? And one of her missions moving forward, since the fall has been to bring into, for example, the Commerce Department, more people who really understand technology, right? To engage more actively with the business community, that is focused on technology and especially on advanced technology, to understand, if we have this particular chip, is there a way to modify it so that you can still sell it for gaming while in fact ensuring that it's not being used by the Chinese, in hypersonic missiles? So I think, one of the areas of debate, especially between, I would say, the administration and Congress, is just how aggressive we need to be. How fast should we be moving? How much time should we spend making sure we get it right up front, as opposed to kind of swinging widely and then trying to recalibrate and bring things back again? I think that's, a sort of central issue. I'd say probably another one is on the overall trade policy and the extent to which the U.S. should be out there doing trade deals, and the extent to which this isn't the time for that. Trade deals have overwhelmingly negatively affected, broad swaths of the American public, and this isn't the path forward. Right. And so you've seen, the Commerce Department has led, for example, in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, right, which is really about setting standards and norms for 14 countries, including the United States, around trade and investment, with supply chains, clean technology, looking at labor and corruption standards, and it's a different form of an agreement, right? But it's designed to incentivize U.S. business and others to invest in these countries, and I think that's important. It's a different way of approaching things. Maybe it'll be foundational for a trade agreement in the future.
So I want to pull back here a little bit. At the beginning, at the introduction, I referenced your new piece in Foreign Affairs, and it is called China's Alternative Order. And in there you say Xi Jinping's ambition to remake the world is undeniable, and China believes it has acquired the capability to advance its vision. So maybe step back for a second here and talk about, in your view, what does China want? What does Xi Jinping really, really want? And talk a little bit too. I know you've been at this for a long time, and others in the space have been working on China for a very long time. But how do you know that this is the case, given you've got a quite opaque and now encapsulated in a singular figure, the kind of the strategic direction of the country?
Right. I actually don't think there's that much mystery around Xi Jinping anymore. I think you can look at what Xi Jinping says. He's now got 4 volumes of his speeches, thousands of pages of what he, believes the world should look like, by 2049. So I don't think it's that confusing. And you take what he says and you match that up with what he does, with his initiatives, and I think there's a pretty compelling picture of Xi's vision. And I don't think that it is sort of, reform around the margins. It is transformative. And I think it's across 5 dimensions, right? And so sometimes I think of it as concentric circles, right, of Chinese influence, beginning with China, basically redrawing the very map of China, right, to take control of areas that China believes are its sovereign territory. So, for example, Taiwan, right, or, the area within the South China Sea. China has, conflicts with Bhutan, obviously with India. We saw the border conflict erupt in 2020 in the midst of COVID with, actually full-scale, military fighting. So all told, China has conflicts with 14 different countries, right? So I think in the first instance, it's about China reclaiming its sovereign territories. I think beyond that, China wants the United States out of the Indo-Pacific as the dominant power, right? It believes that, as Xi Jinping is, fond of saying, Asia is for Asians to govern. And that is not Japan and India leading in the region. It's China leading in the region. Then I think you have China's influence globally through things like the Belt and Road Initiative, right? China, why not, says, why shouldn't we be the United States and the Europe of the 21st century and, set out the digital infrastructure for the 21st century, right? And the hard infrastructure. Why shouldn't our norms and values be represented in the choices of other countries? And I think there's, up at the top, you have China's efforts to influence and to shape sort of international norms and institutions, which was a lot of the focus of the piece that I had in Foreign Affairs, right? So China's pushing to de-dollarize the global economy. It has ideas about the end of the U.S.-led alliance system, right? It calls the U.S.-led alliance system, a relic of the Cold War, anachronistic. It has a different conception of human rights. It doesn't believe in universal human rights as sort of a fundamental element that all countries and all peoples everywhere should be entitled to. it says development should be the priority, economic rights should be the priority, and then maybe you come to political rights, and maybe not, because as Xi Jinping has said, every country has its own historical trajectory, its own civilization. It should be able to determine, what the state, by the way, should be able to determine what constitutes the rights for the people within its sovereign territory. And then finally, and I think this is critical for understanding the direction in which the U.S.-China economic relationship has moved, Xi Jinping has a different vision of China's role in the global economy, which is to say he's advanced his notion of dual circulation. And what does that mean? He says China has a large enough economy that it can innovate, manufacture, and consume largely within itself. It still wants the international community, international business, right, to locate parts of their supply chains within China. It wants that dependence. And at the same time, it wants to be a dominant exporter. But fundamentally, it wants to insulate the Chinese economy from the pressures of the global economy while nonetheless shaping the global economy itself. So I think, in my mind, as China pushes forward with this vision, that really does represent a very different world from the world in which we live today, and we need to understand that.
So some observers express puzzlement over the notion that they want such fundamental change, considering that by playing in the sort of the world that the U.S. established coming out of what we refer to as globalization, essentially, transformed China from a very, very poor country into the second largest economy in the world and one of the most powerful countries in the world. All the more remarkable because it happened in such a short period of time and on such a large scale. So these people would argue they would want to change things around the margins to have a bigger seat at the table, so to speak. They've earned it, et cetera, versus why shake up something so fundamental if you don't know what's on the other side? And this is what's made you rich in the first place.
Yeah, so I think there's an element of truth to that, certainly. And I think for many people within inside China, including many people within the Chinese elite, and certainly many people in the Chinese business community, that is an argument that they themselves would make, just exactly what you said. That is not the argument that Xi Jinping would make, right? First of all, he would attribute China's success, 90% to the role of the Communist Party and the role of the Chinese people, much less about what the international community has brought to China. He will pay lip service to that, but fundamentally, he is all about the party. And I think that is the critical point. If you look back to 2010, 2011, just that period before Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, what did you see? You saw that the Communist Party was corrupt. It had become basically a stepping stone for personal, political, and economic advancement. There was no sort of moral center or coherent ideology around which party members would sort of align themselves. It was basically every person for him or herself, right, and personal advancement. Yeah. You had 180,000 protests. You had people calling for political reform, pushing for environmental change. You had billionaires, Chinese billionaires with 10, 20 million followers on China's Weibo, talking about the need for greater political reform. So actually challenging in some ways the power of the moral authority of the Chinese Communist Party. So Xi Jinping walks into this, and he is a true believer. This is a man who applied to become a member of the Chinese Communist Party 10 times before he was accepted into the party. He never gave up, right? His response to the chaos of the Cultural Revolution and to the suffering that his family personally endured, where his father was jailed, for example, was, in fact, to double down on becoming a member of the Communist Party, not to say, I reject this system and what it's done to our country and my family. So he's a true believer. He comes in and says the most important thing to him is having a robust Chinese Communist Party at the forefront of the political system, cleaning it up. He launches a huge anti-corruption campaign, which continues today, has not stopped, has not wavered. He, has instituted, Xi Jinping thought. He has made it so that he can hold the three most important positions in perpetuity, right? Upended the Chinese constitution so that he could be president for more than 2 terms. He's done everything in his power to centralize control, right? Move away from the market, move away from the marketplace of ideas, and move away from the market in terms of the economy. So I think he came to his position with a fundamentally different approach than the one that you articulated, and a fundamentally different understanding of what makes China great.
So as an advisor to policymakers, is your starting point, I mean, if you put aside the some of the motivations that you've just articulated about Xi Jinping and the ideology and so on, but just looking at China as a large player in the world, and you talk about the sort of the 5 concentric circles that you kind of that you laid out for us. Do you look at some of those as legitimate concerns on their part that we, the United States, and the rest of the international community does need to work around and accommodate to some degree? So, for instance, you made the point about the U.S., China's desire to have the U.S. Navy out of the Indo-Pacific as an example. I presume if we had the Chinese Navy crawling around off of the California coast or whatnot with great regularity, we wouldn't be happy about that either. I mean, you can sort of, if you put yourself in their shoes, you can see to some degree why they have some of the views that they have, and do we accommodate that in any way, or what? Is this something we have to just be firmly pushing back on?
I mean, I think to your point, it depends on exactly what we're talking about. So in the case that you raised, for example, the U.S. military and the Navy, those are just freedom of navigation, operations that are in internationally recognized waters. We are not going into China's EEZs. The challenge is that China has a much more expansive vision of what constitutes its territorial waters than anyone else recognizes in the region, and then is recognized by international law, right? This was actually put to the test in 2016 in a case that the Philippines brought, and China lost. So no, I don't think we should be accommodating China and its desire to push the U.S. Navy out of internationally recognized waters. Having said that, if China, and it has in fact, sent its navies and submarines off the coast of California, off the coast of Alaska, so it is patrolling all around, it has the right to do that outside of our EEZs. So that would be one example. Where I do think there's room, for us to engage in ways that are different, probably revolves around, greater room for not just China, but other middle and emerging economies at the table to talk about the global economy. Right? I think they deserve a larger voice, so let's give it to them. When we're talking about the rules of AI governance, for example, and here we haven't begun to engage with the Chinese, I think it's really important, again, not just the Chinese, but a broader range of countries than our traditional allies in Europe, than our traditional allies, in Asia, the advanced economies where we kind of sit down at the table, we come up with the rules that we like, and then we go to the rest of the world and say, hey guys, here are the best rules, you should just sign on to these. So I think there's room for us to expand the decision-making table. Having said that, there are going to be some areas where we're just going to disagree, around the issue of human rights. Now, personally, I'd love to see us sit down with the Chinese and agree we're going to do a better job on economic rights for our people, and you need to do a better job on political rights for your people. Now, do I think that conversation is going to happen? Probably not. But that would be something that I could see as fitting what you're talking about, where there's room for us to have discussions that, again, expand the tent.
Another area of debate in this country amongst China observers and the media and the like is this concept of peak China. And I guess you can actually disaggregate, right? There's peak geopolitical China, and there's also peak economic China. And I'm wondering what your views are on that. And I note that in the same issue of foreign affairs, Evan Medeiros, for the audience's sake, was former White House official leading Asia policy in the Obama White House. He writes that, and talking about this, some have been commenting on the economic slowdown in China as a particular concern for Chinese leadership and the like. And I note that they just finally announced this morning that they are going to have the third plenum, which was supposed to happen last year and did. And I'd be interested to know why you think that got delayed or if it matters. But he says in his essay, Evan Medeiros does, that it's critical to understand that Xi and other CCP leaders do not see their country as declining. Instead, they see themselves as making hard choices to restructure the economy. And Xi is not merely comfortable with the current economic underperformance. He's actively promoting it, sort of suffering growing pains as they undergo this strategic transformation of their economy. Where do you kind of fall out on that?
Evan's a good friend of mine. He actually shared the article with me ahead of time, and I was able to comment on it. I think he's exactly right. And I think, look, when we all know sort of the range of China's economic problems, right? We can tick them off, the property sector, local government debt, youth unemployment, low consumer demand, over and over and over again. We see these. And Xi Jinping's response is basically, chirku, eat bitterness, youth, and go down to the countryside or take a factory job. Imagine if President Biden were to say that to recent college graduates. Yeah, sorry, there are no jobs for you. You can go work in a factory or, go to rural America and try to help people. That's my response to you. Nobody would stand for that, right? After 4 years of investing your money, which is what Chinese parents do too, and Chinese youth do too, by the way. So I think Evan is right on target that Xi Jinping, the issue of overcapacity, right? We had Secretary Yellen go to China to say, hey, this is a problem for us. You need to stop with, producing all these EVs and the batteries and solar panels and wind turbines, and you're drowning us, and, you don't have the demand here. And China's like, sorry, Charlie, this works for us. Right. So I think he's 110% right. And I think he's also right that the peak China's economy is, let's state the obvious, is so large and so complex that you can have part of the economy, leading the world, right? Huge innovation, world-beating sectors, and part of it really stagnating and not doing well, which is the situation I think we have now. And China also has an incredible repressive apparatus, right? So the fact that it has 600 million people in rural China living on $150 a month or less, right, for the past decade, again, if that were the case in our country, you'd have protests everywhere around this. Instead, they contain it, they control it. And so, which is why we've seen the complete drop-off in protests on the streets, because Xi Jinping has put in place this unbelievable system of surveillance and repression. So they're able to support this part of the economy and repress that part of the economy and not deal with protests or, an election every 4 years or anything of the sort. So I think for me, when I look at the Chinese economy, that's one thing I think about. The second thing I think about is, yes, take into account what's happening now. It's really important to understand all the data that we're getting on a daily, monthly basis, but also look to Xi Jinping's ambitions. And I think this is Evan's point too, right? Is that Xi has a set of targets that he's driving toward, right? And everything else is just, gets in the way. He just pushes it aside. We need to understand where it is that China wants to go. Let me give one little example of this. The electric car, right? The EV market. I remember, I think it was last spring now or last fall when they had the auto show, right? Just earlier this year, maybe in Shanghai. So I think it was last year. Anyway, so they had the auto show and everybody was astonished that China's EVs were so advanced, right? And all of a sudden China's become the dominant exporter. And for me, I look back, China's had a new energy vehicle program in place since 1999, right? And if you were to look at that program at any point in time between then and now, you would have said, how do they keep going? Because it is a complete mess, right? They're producing buses without seats, cars without engines, just to meet targets, right? It's terrible, but they persist. And eventually they succeed. So I think we have to understand sort of the difference in the way that China drives, the Chinese leadership drives its economy, their economy, and both the successes and failures that then leads to. They don't operate the way we operate, and applying our model to them is not going to work.
So, I want to turn to Xi Jinping here for a moment, because in a way you kind of answered my question, because you say they persist and they finally get there. So going back all the way, and you made this point, Xi Jinping tried 10 times to get into the Communist Party, and and he persisted. It's like me trying to get into the Council on Foreign Relations. I finally made it, but anyway. But my point is that the man has got a vision, whether you like it or not, or agree with it or not. I guess my question is on the execution risk. And here I want to ask you about your views on the system, because here was a system that has this autocratic party, the mechanism, the Chinese Communist Party. And as we look at autocracies around the world over time, and we've seen this probably in Russia, most evidently, the quality of decision making goes down. All of the would-be even loyal opposition is put aside or eliminated, and the like, and inevitably more paranoia sets in, and so on. And I wonder, as Xi Jinping embarks on this kind of unprecedented third term of his presidency, he has cleared the decks of all of the factions in the standing committee and the like. Yes, he's got the vision, but is the quality of decision making and the quality of the information and what he's being told that he's going to base those decisions on, is that going to deteriorate over time, and does that compromise their ability to actually get where they want to go? Yeah.
So let me answer that two ways. So it's a question, I have to say, that I and I would say my colleagues in the space of China researchers and scholars ask when we go to China. We ask of our Chinese friends and colleagues, are you able to get your ideas through to Xi Jinping, right? So if you look at sort of the top range of scholars who traditionally were being invited to salons with people like Jiang Zemin, right, yeah, former leader of China, to share their views. Some will say, yes, we have a system by which, every week papers that we write are transmitted up through the party apparatus and into the central decision-making, sort of leadership. And then others will say, when they ask me to write something and I have a view that's different from the one that I know that they're already pursuing, I just say no. Because I know if I put something forward that is different, then I'm going to get in trouble. I have noticed that there is much more, so that's one sort of response. The answer is, who knows? Really are two very different. Maybe it's those who are politically in favor, feel that their views are being heard, and those that, are not being heard. And that answers your question, I think, by saying that they're probably not getting the full range of perspectives. The degree to which that they are closing down economic information, right? So we've seen over the past year that, for example, they stopped publishing youth unemployment figures for 6 months. Right. And, now they have a new methodology, which resulted in, youth unemployment going from somewhere above 20% down to like 5.5%, which everybody knows is ridiculous, right? There's no way that they've seen that shift happen in the past, 4 or 5 months. So I think that would argue that indeed they are not, getting all the information. They could produce 2 sets of information, but undoubtedly there's a desire to present the better information, especially to a leader like Xi Jinping. Yeah. So I think that's, to me, they're probably not getting the best quality information. I also think there is now in China a lot of unhappiness with the direction in which Xi Jinping is moving the country. And this is something that I've been thinking about over the past several months. When you compare the United States and China, in many respects, China is as polarized a society as the United States, right? Polarized along gender lines, along ethnic lines. It is as unequal in terms of income distribution as the United States is. You don't see it, again, because we're not having those protests, because dissent is so contained. But a friend of mine a scholar told me that he's a member of 200 different chat groups. Yeah, 200. I can't even stay on top of one, but he's a member of 200 different. He said one of them has been shut down 26 times. Every time there's a word that appears, right, the system closes down. Then they just reconstitute it. Right. So I think there's a lot more going on there. We see people leaving China, right? Capital leaving China, like people using, bars of gold to get out of China. So I think those kinds of signals we should all be paying attention to in terms of a sense of, sort of, I don't know whether it's distrust or just really discomfort and unhappiness with the direction that she's moving the country.
It's really remarkable how one of the sort of most fundamental social compacts was sort of the same in the United States as it was in China. This kind of view that you would do better than your parents and your children will do better than you. And in both cases, that doesn't seem to be the view of the population anymore. And, so I just want to wind up on Xi, because I think, Evan Osnos, in his widely read New Yorker piece on China last fall, made this point that, Xi has really returned China to the rule of man versus the rule of law. And he referred to him as Xi Jinping is Mao with money. Is kind of the way he put it. And so I wonder, since he consolidated power for this third term, and since then there have been these additional purges, particularly in the military, and I'm wondering if that's a sign of weakness or is that a sign of strength on Xi's part, in your view?
So I think it's a sign of weakness in the sense that, he launched so these are all ostensibly on the grounds of corruption.
Yes.
Right? He launched this anti-corruption campaign the minute he walked in the door, right? Number one priority for him, 2012. We are now 12 years into, right, his third term, and he still hasn't actually addressed this problem. He still hasn't managed to put in the regulations, the incentives, the disincentives for people to do the right thing, ostensibly. I think these are politically motivated anti-corruption charges, right? Some of these people that he's gone after, for example, he removed the head of China's cybersecurity commission, Lu Wei. He put him in place, right? So why, right? Some of this corruption took place years ago, right? And now is coming to light? No. They've had these records. They know. It's a matter of when they decide they want to go after someone. So I think, to me, the interesting question is, why are they going after them now? So I would imagine there are other issues aside from corruption. It could be that they're not good at their job. It could be that they are doing things politically that Xi Jinping finds threatening. Maybe they're part of a small group of people that are opposed to the direction in which Xi is moving the country. We don't actually know. But to my mind, the fact that he has yet to address this issue of corruption in a systemic way, and part of that's because it's all done from the top down, right? It's not the media that is able to go. Journalists don't just go and expose. They used to, pre-Xi Jinping, right? But then Xi Jinping said, no, this control rests in my hands, rests in the control of the Central Disciplinary Commission. I think that, to me, is a sign of weakness. And now his new thing is corruption among the youth, right? This is going to be a new campaign coming down the pike. So clearly, all these years of education have failed to instill in Xi Jinping's mind the correct values in the youth.
So let's turn to American policy now again. And I guess there's a fundamental question. I think either you or Evan in your piece ask this question of whether it's China's strengths or China's weaknesses that are actually the greatest risk to the world and to the United States, in a sense. But I guess, what do you think the U.S. policy response collectively and strategically really ought to be here? Are we on the right path, knowing that we could have a change in administration in less than a year's time, et cetera? But sort of in general, are we looking at China the right way, clear-eyed way, and setting up policy preferences that meeting that challenge? And I'm talking about not just our strategic array in the Indo-Pacific. I saw Admiral Aquilino's comments on the boiling of the frog this past week in the region, but also our industrial policy and our export controls and all of these elements. Are you fundamentally in favor, or do you think we're being short-sighted on some of this stuff?
Yeah. So I think we have, the pillars of our policy are basically right. That is, we're, competing. We're investing in R&D. We're investing in advanced manufacturing. I think that is number one, right? Running faster, to me, is the number one thing. The defensive elements, the export controls, supply chain resiliency, the in- and outbound investment restrictions, I think these are important. But again, I think we want to approach them with a degree of caution. We want to make sure that we understand all the implications of steps we take and why we're taking them, and not simply elevate them with inflammatory political rhetoric. Just, by way of example, this whole issue of Chinese purchasing U.S. agricultural land. I mean, the amount of land they've purchased is like 0.05%, right? A lot of that was purchased by Syngenta before it was even a Chinese company. Of course, we want to make sure that when they're a Chinese, entity is buying land in North Dakota that's not too far from an Air Force base. Yeah, we don't like that, right? But other than that, what is it that we're trying to get at here? And I think we need to ensure that we're not, inflaming things in some respect to build unity in our country at a time when we lack social cohesion. So almost using China to develop a sense of social cohesion. And I think China, by the way, does the same thing. I think they often use the United States as a scapegoat for their own domestic ills and problems. So I think that, to me, is one thing that we really want to be careful of, and maybe we don't pay enough attention to, like the TikTok issue, for example. Are we sure we're getting this right? There are definitely security issues. Are we sure that efforts to de-risk that couldn't work, as opposed to just banning it unless the Chinese government is willing to sell it to a U.S. entity? So I'd like a little more caution around that. I think, you don't want to talk about our allies and partners. I think that's a crucial part of our strategy, though. We can't do this alone. And if we can't develop a compelling enough narrative that our allies and partners want to come along with us, that maybe should tell us something as well. But I think actually the administration has done a phenomenal job of building back relationships.
Yeah, let me drill down on that a little bit, because you make the point in your piece, that rather than dismissing Beijing's playbook, we should learn from it and seize the mantle of change, right? And a critical element, I think everybody has been struck, and here we can pull back just from the China relationship to the greater global global picture that President Biden and his administration, re-engagement and reinvigoration of NATO, and I mean, Russia helped it in a sense, but the fact is that the United States demonstrated the leadership that's necessary in NATO, has embraced the allies, and built up these institutions like AUKUS and the Quad in the Indo-Pacific region as examples. But to a certain degree, the strength that China has shown, or what China has achieved in the sort of the global space, adding to, for instance, the BRICS group, and with others trying to join, and is it because China is so popular, or is it that the United States has gotten itself to be somewhat unpopular, and with our own hypocrisy on some of our values, and some of the execution that we've had on certain things, the global financial crisis, foreign policy overreach perhaps in places like Iraq and the like, that we've got to get our house in order in a sense, and that is the most compelling argument for rest of world.
Yes, I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think our number one priority has to be to get our own house in order, and it's really hard right now. There's no two ways about it. And again, China in that respect provides a convenient foil for us, right? Not only domestically, but also on the international stage, right? And China's support of Russia, right, in its invasion of Ukraine, contributed to the EU's, the European Union's, really jumping, onto our side when it comes to recognizing the challenge that China presents. So China has been, in some respects, our best friend and its own worst enemy by actions that it's taken with regard to Europe and, again, probably countries in the Indo-Pacific. But you're right, when you look at a number of emerging and middle income economies globally, they are attracted to China's voice, right? To the idea that more countries deserve more influence and more power in shaping the rules of the game. And, we have not been very good about that. And if you look at U.S. policy toward Latin America, toward Africa, many cabinet secretaries and deputy secretaries have made trips to Africa at this point. But is there really a vision for including them at the table in a significant way? And the same holds true for Latin America, right? And so I think that's an area where our administration, this administration, the next administration, needs to do better. I think we need to bring them to the table, engage them up front, and again, not just simply engage with our traditional allies and partners and then come to them. So a continent like Africa, like if we were to propose something like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was negotiated by all the partner, countries for Africa, I think that would be terrific. Be a hard lift, but it would be terrific.
Right.
But bring them into our supply chains, right? Where is Africa when we talk about chips and science, when we talk about the Inflation Reduction Act? Where are they in terms of sort of supply chains, right? The State Department has money to do work. A lot of that's going to the Indo-Pacific.
Now, I know you were just in Kenya. So do you see, is the field still open enough for us to be able to have in other words, China hasn't locked everything up in these places. It's still an argument to have.
For sure. And I think here, too, to some extent, China's been its own worst enemy because the Belt and Road Initiative, for all that it has brought some needed infrastructure, also was pursued in ways that, caused protests in virtually every single Belt and Road country around the way that China did its projects, exporting its own labor, its own materials, a number of countries really increasing their debt levels a lot because of, loans that they were taking from the Chinese government for projects that may never turn a profit, may never realize anything close to the money that they had to borrow from China to make the project come to fruition. So there's unhappiness in many countries. And I mean, the trip to Kenya with Secretary Raimondo was amazing. The receptivity to the United States, to the Secretary, we came with about 14 companies, everybody was so excited. Meetings with the presidents, with the trade ministers, with ICT ministers, actually from around Africa. There's enormous enthusiasm for having the United States more deeply engage in the region. So I don't think that the door is shut by any means. Again, I think, China puts forth a lot of attractive sounding proposals, but when push comes to shove, there is a lot of enthusiasm for the United States, for higher standards, for American, technology to come and to lead the way there.
And it seemed like for a long time there was this view that American money or American investment, American development support came with a lot of strings attached with regards to human rights, with regards to corruption issues and the like. And the realization has come to a lot of countries as well that China's money comes with strings attached as well.
Different strings. Exactly.
But can be equally problematic in a sense. I guess I wanted to digress for 1 second, go back to something you were talking about a few minutes ago, and that was with regards to China's military. We were talking about the purges in the military and so on. But obviously everybody is aware that this is the greatest sort of peacetime military buildup in history. They've got a larger Navy than the United States now. We know that they are trying to build their strategic nuclear force to, if not on a par with Russia and the United States, at least getting toward that level and the like. On the other hand, this is a military that hasn't fought a war since 1979. We have seen what an overestimation of a big military like Russia's can do, and to a leadership as well. What's your assessment of the quantitative and qualitative picture on the Chinese military right now?
I think you've pointed out, I think, the strengths and weaknesses quite well. I think we can't afford to underestimate. And I don't think we can sit back and say, yes, they haven't fought a war. The last one they fought, 1979, their invasion of Vietnam, did not work out well for them. No. So, but this is a fundamentally different China, right? And their military technology is extremely advanced. In the Indo-Pacific, they have the advantage of, being located there, right? We face the tyranny of distance. We do have bases in the Philippines and Japan. So when it comes to Taiwan, for example, we do have positioning that is beneficial. But I wouldn't, count them out by any stretch of the imagination. And that there was just a recent report that came out from the American Enterprise Institute that says if you look at, one of the things that people have fallen back on in the United States is the idea that China China's spending on its military is roughly 1/3 that of the United States. This report by AEI says if you look at it in terms of purchasing power parity, which you can do if China is primarily manufacturing its own arms, right, internally, and is paying its own labor, which it is for the military, that actually China's spending is on par with that of the United States. I think that should give us enormous pause.
Right.
So, the fact that we have caps on our military spending right now, due to sort of congressional engagements, I think is a mistake. And I know in the third piece in the Foreign Affairs Journal by Matt Pottinger and Congressman, or I guess now former Congressman Gallagher, talks about the need to ramp up our military significantly. But I think part of that has to do with Congress, right? And limitations that Congress is putting on the administration. So, I think there are going to definitely be deficits that will emerge. But they have, Xi Jinping has radically restructured the military. He's modeled it on the U.S. military. They've improved their command and control. I don't think there's anyone in the U.S. military who's sanguine about the ability of the Chinese military to compete at this point.
This may sound like a loaded question, but I think it's a legitimate one. In your view, what do you think China makes of or thinks of Donald Trump, knowing that they've had some experience with him? There's a possibility that Trump comes back as president, but that a Trump 2.0 might look different than a Trump 1.0 did. But he's also a transactional guy. Do they see him as this great disruptor that's can potentially get in the way of the linear way that they're looking at their progress, or somebody that they can work with?
Maybe neither. So I think the way that they view Donald Trump is as someone who is likely to provide an opening for them. And if you look back to 2017, when Donald Trump first started, and he started pulling the U.S. out of international agreements and organizations, talked about taking us out of NATO, all of these things. TPP, right, got out of TPP, the end. Has already said he would, deconstruct the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So I think they look at that and they say, this is great. Wide open for us now and all of our global vision. And I think they said that back in 2017, 2018. And if you were to look back, you would see a lot of articles at the time that talked about China filling the vacuum that was being left by the United States. I have to say, I wrote a piece that said that's not happening. That's not going to happen because they weren't ready then to fill the vacuum. I think today they're ready to fill that vacuum. So if I were to say for Xi Jinping himself, looking at Donald Trump, yes, Donald Trump will be a headache for Xi Jinping. The tariffs, more export controls, et cetera. This is also something President Biden is likely to continue to do. Where Donald Trump provides the Chinese with an advantage is in his rejection of the traditional role of the United States as a leader on the global stage. And I think for that, President Xi would say, welcome, Donald Trump.
Right. So I want to kind of end on, we obviously spend our days advising a lot of major multinational and American corporations in particular. They are caught in the middle of all of this, obviously, and they are trying to navigate this. And I wonder, because there is a view, it seems to me, in China that, on this, going back to what we were talking about, there's this bipartisan consensus in Washington on China. And yet a lot of American corporations still want to do business in China. There's a 1.4 billion person consumer base there. There's the state of the art manufacturing supply chain. At the end of the day, America still consumes more stuff than anybody else does, and China still makes more stuff than anybody else does. We have to meet in the middle in a way. So what's your, and I know this is a general question, companies are at the one end of the national security spectrum, or they're not, in a sense, but I mean, it's a very confusing time. And to some degree, Beijing views corporate America as their last best friend, probably, in the US. How are you advising companies right now to be thinking about this?
So I think, in Washington, the tenor of the debate is ranges from U.S. companies that are strictly in consumer products and are, selling in China, go, right? All systems go, green light, to we really should be encouraging all our companies to think about gradually, if not pulling out of China, certainly ensuring that new investment is going to other markets. I think there has been this idea in a broad swath of corporate America that the China for China investment strategy will protect them, and that from like congressional attack, for example, that may be changing a little bit. I'm a little more concerned that at least in some parts of the economy, that's not going to be good enough. So when I'm talking to U.S. companies, the thing that I always say is do what you can to support U.S. broader interests, right? So if you see a way to support U.S. engagement in the Indo-Pacific economic framework, step up. Come and visit with Secretary Raimondo, Secretary Yellen. Talk to them about what can your company do to help, the United States as a global economic power to advance our broader economic and security interests. I think that to me is the best strategy. And then, ensure if you are in the technology space that you're in constant discussion with people at the NSC, with people at Commerce, to get a good sense of the overall direction in which the export control, sort of move is moving, and that small yard, high fence, how big is that yard going to get? So I think the best strategy certainly is not to ignore what's going on in Washington and to continue doing what you're doing and hope for the best. The much better strategy is to step up, to make clear that you are a U.S. company first and foremost, and you support, U.S. broader engagement in the global economy. At the same time, the China market is important, but you want to make sure that whatever you're doing, continues to protect U.S. national security interests. I think that's how you do the best job in safeguarding your company's interests in what is likely to be a really difficult period for the next, certainly, 3 to 5 years.
If you put your advisor to Gina Raimondo hat back on for a moment, if you rewind the tape, and I've made this point on this program in the past, when China lifted the zero COVID policy last spring, that fewer than 50% of the Fortune 100 CEOs had been CEO at the time that China went into zero COVID. In other words, they had not been to China in the capacity of CEO. So all of a sudden, everybody starts going back. And you can see the full court press, most recently at the China Development Forum, and the fact that Xi Jinping himself then engaged with a number of CEOs. They are sending this signal that we are open for business, don't be afraid. And a lot of companies, to your point, have got this confusion about how big the small yard high fence and how high the fence is ultimately going to get. And on top of that, I think finding that these managements and their predecessors had spent literally decades building this perfect supply chain system in China with China's cooperation. And they had built these, relationships and networks there. And they have spent very little time, relatively speaking, in terms of management bandwidth and money, et cetera, in all of these other markets around the world that are now vying to be, the decoupling or de-risking destinations, whether it be Vietnam, Mexico, Hungary, whatever the case may be, and that there's a great deal of uncertainty there. And if there's anything that businesses want, it is certainty. And China is saying we're providing you with certainty, and the United States right now is we're rewriting the rules right now. So things are going to be changing, and there's a new administration coming one way or the other. So it's a tough moment right now for companies, and knowing that anything that they say is going to be read very differently in Washington than it is in Beijing.
Yes. Is that a question?
I guess it's more of a statement.
Right.
But I mean,
no, I agree.
It speaks to the complexity of what they're trying to navigate.
Right. I mean, I might take a little issue with your point that while everything is changing in the United States, China we're open for business. I think if we've seen anything over the past, year, 2 years, even putting aside COVID and the challenges that presented, it's, the tightening up on the, data security, it's the, espionage law, it's the, again, that retrenchment in terms of the willingness of China to share economic information that's actually really important for businesses to know in order to make smart investment decisions. I don't see that changing. And when Xi Jinping says we're open for business and sits with that, very small group, let's face it, of CEOs at the China Development Forum, I mean, hard pressed to believe that anybody who's been paying attention to what's been going on in China, any of these corporations, is actually feeling comfortable with increasing investment in a significant way if they're in spaces that are likely to be affected by the espionage or the data security, et cetera. I think, the companies that I've spoken to, a lot of them are in the space of, we have a small advantage in X area, and we're going to play this out as long as we can, but we recognize in 20 years, it may all be over for us, right? And part of that is just the rate at which, China itself is innovating. It's moving up, the value chain, and it is putting in place laws, sometimes not even laws, but just informal regulations that advantage Chinese companies. Right. That's clear. And so that competitive landscape, in addition to all of the strictures that are being put in place by the government, the competitive landscape is changing in ways that really do disadvantage a lot of U.S. companies. So I think the opportunities there for many are becoming more constrained. And that's not to excuse all of the churn in the United States as the U.S. government tries to get its arms around this really difficult sense of, first, and here, let me just say, I think we need to do a better job because, part of what the U.S. government is doing is saying these are economic things that are tied to national security, right? And so we have to control them. Other things are related to economic competitiveness. And so, the tariffs, for example, right? We need to not conflate, right, the issues of economic security and national security and economic competitiveness. And so I think the U.S. government could do a better job of distinguishing, among those three lanes and saying, here are the policies that are dedicated to this set of issues. Here are the ones that are dedicated to this set of issues. And then I think that giving that kind of clarity to the U.S. business community would also be helpful. But fundamentally, I think this isn't a time in either country for many companies to be making big new bets in China.
Right. And so I guess I want to give you an opportunity to determine where we land the plane here on our conversation today. Question would be either A, there's a lot of talk about, there's certain areas where the United States and China should and can be cooperating, where there's enough common interests that they can come together, perhaps on climate, as an example, is the one that's always thrown around out there. And so I guess my question is that sort of too Pollyanna-ish, and or do you see that there are certain areas where we can improve? Or are you kind of fundamentally pessimistic that not necessarily that the U.S. and China are headed toward a war in the traditional sense down the road somewhere, but that this is a fundamentally contentious relationship, and that at the very end of the day, it's going to be management of it that is really, really critical to avoiding kind of a worst case scenario?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I think the Biden administration approach has been, after it put in place sort of those pillars to, strengthen the United States, the investment, the modernizing the economic tools, and the working with allies. That fourth pillar of cooperation is what we saw come into play last summer and moving through this year with all the visits of the secretaries that you outlined earlier. I think we have cooperation on climate change, right? If there was one area that sort of worked through the entire administration, it was Secretary Kerry working with his counterpart, Xie Jianhua, on the climate issue. We've talked about cooperation on global health issues. All these issues are all the traditional issues, right? Getting back on the mill-to-mill issue. All of those things are there. I think if we look again at the reality of that cooperation, it's much less than we would want. I know in the, Pottinger-Gallagher piece, they kind of were like, ugh, why bother with these dialogues? They're a waste of time. I don't see it that way. I think they're essential. Xi Jinping is not always going to be in power in China, right? There's going to be a transition at some point. We need to maintain these channels of communication. We need to continue to engage with the Chinese people. We need to recognize that there are as many different perspectives in China on any given issue as there are in the United States. I think we do a huge disservice to this relationship if we just say China is an implacable enemy and we need to treat it as such. Fundamentally, though, it is a contentious relationship. So I'll end where I started, which is to say we're at that 90-10. We are 90% competitive and we are 10% cooperative. And if we really wanted to change that dynamic, we would need something much bigger to happen. Two probably leaders that were committed to fundamentally changing the trajectory of this relationship and who had the domestic political wherewithal to accomplish that. I think that's what we would have to have, and I don't think we have that.
Well, I want to thank you for bringing it full circle. A note for the audience that we have only scratched the surface on, and not even been comprehensive in the array of topics that are on the table between these two countries, and you and your peers and colleagues are discussing every single day with policymakers. It's really, really complicated stuff. So I appreciate you coming in here and talking and educating us about this. I'm sure we'll have conversations further in the future on it, but just as a reminder that Liz Economy has got the lead piece in the current edition of Foreign Affairs, and I encourage you all to take a look at it. But until next time, Liz, thanks so much for being here today. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day.